Socrates claims that dialogue or dialectic helps everyone figure out answers to the most important questions. What does Socrates mean by the most important questions? The intuition is something like, of course, all knowledge, anything we can dignify with the name of knowledge, is important. And it is important to love the process of learning and coming to truth. It's important to love wisdom, Socrates thinks. But there are two kinds of knowledge that Socrates prizes, especially prizes. As we saw with the diagram with the 4 levels of reality and the 4 kinds of knowledge, Socrates thinks that there's ultimate knowledge, which is knowledge of the good. One level below that, there's knowledge of ethics. And one level below that, there's knowledge of math. So it's the knowledge of ethics, Socrates says, it is the special function of dialogue to help the philosopher achieve. Socrates thinks that everybody really wants to know what it means to live a good life. Everyone wants to know what justice is so that they can achieve it in their own lives. So yes, math is important. It's important to understand, what the definition of a triangle is and what the consequences of that definition are. But it's even more important, Socrates thinks, for everyone to think about, to examine their own life, to ask themselves, what are the ethical principles of my conduct? And what kind of principles are guiding me towards my life goals? It's that kind of knowledge Socrates calls the most important. So, talking here about the relationship between mathematics and philosophy, Socrates thinks that mathematics, of course, is important to know for its own sake. In other words, mathematics is an inherently valuable kind of knowledge. There's another way that Socrates thinks mathematics is good. He thinks it's instrumentally useful. He thinks that mathematics is a kind of pathway or an opening into philosophy. Because what both mathematics and philosophy ask us to do is to get out of the world of visible things, the material world, the world we can understand and apprehend through our senses, sight and touch and taste and all that, and to get above that line. You remember that big blue line? Socrates often calls this the divided line. To get above the divided line into the world of ideas, where we cannot sense ideas in the same way that I can sense this laptop before me, where we have to use the metaphor, the eye of the mind to grasp ideas, and where we look not with our eyes, but with our mind. So mathematics gets us more and more into the realm of ideas. It's a kind of transitional level of knowledge. So when you see Socrates talking about arithmetic and geometry and astronomy and harmonics, I'm not going to go into the details too much. The important thing to see is that the way to philosophy is being prepared by these various mathematics. So these mathematical disciplines are where you learn about, for example, in arithmetic, ideas, mathematical ideas like addition, subtraction, equality. And once you put those ideas together, you'll be able to understand things like 2 plus 2 equals 4. Not 2 books plus 2 books equals 4 books, but 2 plus 2 equals 4. And you'll see how that both sides of the equation are equal to each other. and you'll see what the notion of addition is doing in that equation and so forth. Okay, and then the same thing with geometry, the same thing with astronomy, same thing with harmonics. Harmonics here is just the study of sound. So here, as with all the mathematical sciences, Socrates thinks we need to stop relying too much on our senses. So for example, just hitting a pitchfork and saying, oh, this one's higher, and then hitting another pitchfork and saying, oh, this note's lower, that's not really harmonics. Harmonics for Socrates means, oh, I see, when the frequency is at this number, it sounds way higher than it does when the frequency is at this lower number. And then trying to understand, well, how much more frequency translates to how much more of a sensible difference in the two notes. Okay, so once again, don't rely on your senses, rely on your mind. Same difference with astronomy. You don't just go about looking at the planets' movements in the skies. You try and get at the math behind the planet's movements. Oh, is it a circle? Is it an ellipse? Okay, can I make predictions based on these mathematical equations, geometric equations maybe, about where this heavenly body is going to be in a month or even just a week? Okay. But again, mathematics is not the main deal. Mathematics cannot really tell us how to live. And doing mathematics, if you just ended there, Socrates would say, would actually give you less than you could achieve, less than you could really achieve. Okay, so it's dialogue, philosophical dialogue or dialectic. That's the main course, the main deal, the most important thing. And Socrates has actually structured this entire book, this entire dialogue in a very precise way. So there is one huge dialectic, we could say, that is this book. And remember, one of the things that distinguishes philosophy from mathematics is in mathematics, you start with a hypothesis and you reason your way down to a conclusion. Whereas in philosophy, you start with a hypothesis and then you reason your way up to the first principle. And only once you've established the first principle are you able to reason your way back down to a secure conclusion. So Socrates thinks that mathematical knowledge is not as secure as philosophical knowledge because it hasn't reached the first principles. Philosophy, by contrast, has gone all the way to the end in questioning and examining assumptions until it's able to just state, yes, I believe that ultimate reality is the good. And then once you've secured that premise and you've established that premise and turned it into a kind of axiom. Axiom is what mathematicians and philosophers call a kind of just the grounding point, the starting point. But once you've established the axiom, then everything that follows, well, we'll have greater confidence in every conclusion that follows. Okay, so here I've got a diagram of how the entirety of the book is laid out, and I'll try and do this quickly, because really it's a one diagram summary of the entire book. And this structure behind the 9 books, 300 something pages, it's not immediately apparent. It's not immediately apparent, but once you see what the shape of this book is, and it's basically this giant triangle, I think you'll see that it's very well structured, it's very well put together, and it's been very well planned. It's actually kind of amazing. Like every passage in this book, every idea fits into this huge structure. Okay, so what you'll notice here is that We start at the bottom of this diagram with the psyche, or the individual. And then in the intermediate range or scale, we've got the polis, or the city. And then at the highest level, we've got the macro scale, which is the cosmos, or the universe. Okay, so we've got these three levels, and we're going to start at the psyche with the question of, is injustice or justice better for the individual? So in books 1 and 2, the question is set up and the question is framed. In books 3 and 4, Socrates tries to develop an answer to this question. Socrates reasons, well, you can't really say what's better, justice or injustice, at the level of the psyche without addressing this question of what is justice itself. Once we have the idea of justice itself, then we can apply it to both the city and the soul. And this is the books where Socrates basically shifts the dialogue into a higher level, a larger scale, and he's dealing with justice in the city. So Socrates defines justice in the city in terms of these three classes: the people, or everybody else, the helper guardians, the middle level of the city, and the ruler guardians. But Socrates is not satisfied to simply lay out the definition of justice and apply it to the city. He wants to explain the broader class of things that justice actually belongs to. And what is that? Well, that's the good. Justice is among the good things in life that cities as a whole can try and attain. Or, as we'll see in the conclusion, what individuals in this life can try and attain for themselves. Okay, so it's a species of this higher category of things called the good. And that good is the first principle. That is the ultimate reality. That is the ultimate thing we can know about. And as we saw, Socrates is very keen to say that it's the philosopher only who can grasp the good, who can really turn towards the good, and who can really embody the good. Okay, and so we see here that the notion that the philosopher should be king, which is the defining feature of Plato's Republic, that's the defining political proposal, is grounded on, or based on, this first principle, the good. In books 8 through 9, and we'll be talking about book 8 today and book 9 on Monday, Socrates has descended from this very high level of abstraction, the cosmos or the universe, where he's saying the good is the ultimate reality, and he's back into the polis, or the city level. And Socrates is going to take the standard of justice and say, the city we've been describing, the one that I paid very close attention to in books 3 to 4, in books 8 to 9, I'm going to use this standard to rank all other kinds of cities. And I'll talk more about this special term here, Kallipolis, in a second. But Kallipolis is the standard. It's the just city. It's Plato's Republic. And then there are 4 other kinds of basically inferior cities. So we're going to talk about the standard, and then we're going to reason our way into judgments about other kinds of cities. And once we've achieved that ranking of cities, we can, on the basis of the analogy between city and soul, rank different kinds of people, different kinds of individuals. And as we'll see today, Socrates thinks there are basically 5 kinds of individuals. And if the ranking of cities holds, and the analogy between cities and souls holds, then this ranking of souls will also be valid. And what Socrates is going to try and argue in book 8 is on the basis of this ranking, we see that the just individual who corresponds to the just city is superior to the unjust individual who corresponds to the tyrannical city. And there we end up in book 9, back at the level of the individual or the psyche, and we wrap up this entire huge structure, the entire book. Okay, so Plato's Republic, book 8. I want to talk about two things. I've already said it. We're going to talk about how various other kinds of cities don't live up to the standard of Plato's Republic, how they fall short of the ideal city. Secondly, and I probably won't have time to get to this, or time to finish this part at least, I want to talk about why Socrates, in his ranking of 5 city types, basically places democracy right next to tyranny and places democracy in 4th out of 5th place. What doesn't Socrates appreciate about democracy? Okay. Before we can talk about how the other cities don't live up to the standards, I think it would be useful, by way of review, to explain just one real quick why Socrates thinks Kallipolis, which is just Greek for the beautiful city, why does Socrates think this beautiful city is the standard for any city-state? And he doesn't think, once again, that beauty is this relative thing. He thinks beauty is eternal. He doesn't think justice is this relative thing. He thinks justice is an absolute. Okay, and he thinks he's defined it, and so forth. Okay, so what is the definition? What are the sort of consequences of defining justice at the level of the city in the way that Socrates has? What's so great about the just city, if we want to put it in plainer language? Well, there are 4 attributes, Socrates says, that should give us confidence that the city he describes is the best. The first is that it's unified. This taps into that aspect of justice, which is about arranging parts so that they fit together in one harmonious whole. So the idea of justice as minding your own business, as well as the idea of justice as giving what is due, those are sort of the more common sense ways or more common sense intuitions behind Socrates' more formal definition of justice. That's tapping into this unified city idea. And the idea is the 3 groups or the 3 strata of the city will be harmonized with each other in the same way that 3 strings on a stringed instrument like a guitar or a violin are harmonized with each other. They're in tune with each other. They're attuned to one another. And this is what allows this stringed instrument in this metaphor to produce harmonious sounds. And in the same way, if the rulers are ruling and the helpers are helping to rule, and everybody else is producing goods and services, then the city will be unified and harmonious. The city is also ordered. Socrates would hasten to add properly ordered, which for Socrates means hierarchically ordered. The various roles and functions when it comes to politics are hierarchically ranked. When it comes to the overall life of the city, by way of review, we know that Socrates thinks that the craftsmen and artisans, the people who are making stuff, are equally necessary to the survival of the city as philosophers or soldiers. But when it comes to politics, the philosophers are the most important. Just as Socrates would say, when it comes to producing things, obviously the philosophers are not the most important. It's the artisans and the craftspeople, the people who can cobble together a shoe or a table. They are much more important. Okay, but when it comes to politics, there's a clearly defined hierarchy, and it has the shape of a pyramid. So you can see here that Socrates believes that order is a matter of getting the right people in charge, and that order has a certain shape to it, where wisdom makes the decisions and other people carry the decisions out, and other people recognize the wisdom of those decisions. Okay, so that's the idea that order is a kind of hierarchy, and that if you disrupt the hierarchy, you will get disorder. Okay, the city is excellent. The city is excellent. You could also translate this point as the city is virtuous. As we remember, the just city includes within it a group of people whose specialization is wisdom, a group of people whose specialization is courage, a group of people who are moderate in their desires. Okay, so what does that mean? It means that justice actually includes wisdom, courage, and moderation. Justice is a kind of overall container for those other excellences or virtues. And it's the same difference actually with the soul. You'll remember uh, uh, in the soul, we've got three analogous parts to the three levels of the city. And the reasoning part is the part that achieves wisdom. The spirited part is the part that achieves courage, and the appetitive part is the part that achieves moderation. Okay, when each part is achieving its specific excellence, Socrates thinks the entire city is achieving its purpose or its excellence, which is, once again, justice. Finally, Socrates says, the city will be happy. Socrates is not saying that the city will be instantly gratified. Remember, one of Socrates' claims in Wednesday's lecture is that a lot of philosophers, in fact, would rather stay outside of the cave, in other words, stay in the realm of ideas, and never become kings, and never take up the burdens of political rulership or leadership. Okay, so in a way, those philosophers are not going to be instantaneously gratified. But Socrates thinks if the philosophers properly understand their duty, if they think about where they came from, which is a just city. Remember, we're talking about the scenario where there's a just city, not an unjust city. If the philosophers really have the right notion or concept of their duty, they will see, yes, that they should try and become kings, and they should, in fact, take up this less pleasurable, less immediately gratifying activity of leading the entire city. And Socrates is saying they will have a more lasting satisfaction and a more fulfilled life overall if they take up that function or role of ruler. And of course, it's the same with ordinary people, the everybody else category, and moderation. Of course, sometimes our desire and sometimes our appetites say we should actually just go over the top and go overboard, and we think that would make us happy. And then we wake up the next day and we've drank too much, or we can barely stay awake after this meal where we've basically stuffed ourselves, and then we regret what we did. Okay, so that's the short-term satisfaction, not equaling a long-term satisfaction. The idea is if you get moderation in your soul, thereby making your appetites moderate, you will be more satisfied in the long run and in a sort of holistic way. So the city will be happy and everybody in it will be happy. Okay, so happiness for Socrates does not equal immediate pleasure. That's a very important point here. And we'll see it come back on Monday. Socrates thinks only one regime embodies justice itself. The name of that regime, as we were just saying, is Callipolis, the beautiful city. And so there's a unilinear scale. It's a scale with 2 points running from Callipolis, the best possible city, to tyranny, the worst possible city. So Socrates is not a pluralist. He's not a let 100 flowers bloom type when it comes to different ways of putting your city together. He's not one to say, well, that arrangement is good for Thebes, but it won't, it's not good for Athens. And what's good for Athens is not good for Sparta. His idea is actually there's one kind of city that would be best for all cities. There's one kind of arrangement which would be best for all cities. There's one kind of arrangement, or constitution is the word that Socrates would use. There's one kind of constitution that is second best for all cities, one type which is third best, and so on and so on. So that's the cast of mind Socrates has. And once again, you can see here that Socrates loves ranking things. He loves putting things in order and saying which is better and saying which is worse. So Socrates tells a story. He says, for the sake of argument, let's say Callipolis exists in our material world. That's an important qualification because Socrates thinks Callipolis already exists in the world of ideas, where we saw that the just city is just a variation on the broader idea of justice itself. Justice itself already exists as an idea. The just city, therefore, already exists in the idea world. Socrates says, well, let's take the case of a philosopher becoming a king or a king becoming a philosopher. Remember, those are the 2 ways that Socrates said that Callipolis could come about. So for the sake of argument, Callipolis exists in the material world. We're looking at it. We can go visit Callipolis and so forth. Socrates says, even in this best of all possible circumstances, Callipolis will still be subject to decay and corruption. Callipolis will eventually veer off course. Callipolis will eventually transform into something less good, less just. He kind of cooks up this weird story about how, you remember those large marriage and breeding festivals? He cooks up a rather odd story to our ears about how the ruler guardians will make some bad mathematical calculations about when the marriage festival is held and when the breeding actually occurs, because they're humans. Philosophers are humans. They make mistakes. So somebody miscalculates, and therefore the stock or the quality of the children produced the wrong day. It sounds an awful lot like astrology. I would not take this story too seriously. But you get the message. Something goes wrong, and therefore the city starts to decay. So I wouldn't take too much stock in this astrology sounding story. The real point, and this is a point I think we could all agree with, nothing in the material world lasts forever. It's like the idea, it's like this idea Socrates had about beauty itself versus beautiful flowers. Beautiful flowers exist in this material world. They're here one season and then they die off in the next. And it's the same with cities. Even if you could realize the idea of justice in an actual city, in a city down here in the material world, it couldn't last forever because nothing here in our material world lasts forever. Okay. So there's going to be a process of decay or corruption. This process of decay or corruption has four aspects. Four aspects. So if there were four things that made the just city the best city, namely unity, order, excellence, and happiness, well, you can imagine what will happen to all those distinguishing and excellent qualities. Unity will give rise to faction. And instead of everybody minding their own business, everyone's going to be questioning, well, what is my business? And what is my place? And what's my function? Order is going to turn into disorder. Because remember, Socrates hinged his notion on order on the proper hierarchy. And if people don't respect the proper hierarchy and may even go so far as denying there is a such thing when it comes to politics as more important and less important, that order will very quickly turn into disorder. Thirdly, this big question of who's in charge of the city, the big question for Socrates when it comes to politics. Well, the wrong people are going to be in charge. And what we're going to get is less and less excellent kinds of rulers. And corruption starts at the top. If order and hierarchy start at the top, so does corruption and decay. So rulers are going to lose their excellence. And finally, this happiness or long-range satisfaction will first turn into long-range dissatisfaction, long-range anxieties and fears and unhappiness. And then it will further degenerate, this happiness will further degenerate into perversions and unlawful behavior. And for Socrates, a kind of insanity. So the city goes from being reasonable to tyrannical. Okay. You cannot memorize. If you've read book 8 for today, you'll notice that I'm only talking at a very general level of the overall patterns. You cannot really memorize the details of how each city transforms into the next city. There's just way too many details. I've been reading this book close to 20 years, and I still don't have all the details. There's still things you could ask me about. Well, what about this turn in the story of how you get a democracy? I probably will not remember it. Okay, so do not worry about memorizing the details of the story. Try and get these overall patterns. Try and get the four overall patterns that I've just listed on this slide. Okay, so that's the overall patterns. Now let's talk about the five-fold ranking itself. You see, we've got a diagram where at the bottom, you've got the lack of justice, and at the top, you've got the form of justice or the idea of justice. So some regimes are going to perfectly embody the standard of justice, and some regimes are basically going to deviate from the standard. Actually, I should change the spacing on this. Here's the standard of justice. Some regimes are going to meet it. And then falling from this standard, other regimes are going to be increasingly far from it. And this is a way of saying that Socrates doesn't think that bad really has an existence of its own. For Socrates, what exists is good. Remember, ultimate reality is the good. So what it means is cities that are less and less good are actually less and less real. So it's not the form of justice and then the form of injustice. No, injustice is simply a lack of justice. Injustice is simply a deviation from the standard of justice. Okay, at the very top, we've got Callipolis. And just very quickly, because it should be a review by now, Callipolis is ruled by the philosopher. Defining feature of Callipolis is the philosopher king position. The philosopher is qualified, once again by review, by the excellence of wisdom. That's the special thing the philosopher has in their soul that makes them uniquely qualified for making political decisions. And when the philosopher is filling that function, the philosopher has a kind of happiness, the happiness of knowing, the happiness of apprehending the truth. We could call these platonic pleasures, platonic loves, intellectual pleasure. That's what the philosopher has. In the second kind of city, we've got a different kind of ruler. The ruler is a soldier. So imagine a city where instead of the 3 levels of Callipolis, you've only got 2 levels. You've got a soldier class and everybody else, and there really are no philosopher types around. In that case, Socrates would say, yeah, you should set up what he calls timocracy. Timocracy is just a specialized language for saying rule of the courageous, or actually it's closer to power of the courageous. So the krasi, it's the same as the krasi in democracy. It comes from the word for power, kratos. So power, and then the timo part comes from the Greek word for spirit. Remember that spirited part of the soul, the middle level of the soul? The spirit is called thumos in Greek, and so you get the power of the spirit. Socrates in real life is thinking about cities like Sparta. And if you're not familiar with that, Sparta, maybe you can look it up. But the idea is Sparta is a kind of military aristocracy. And according to the Spartans, what makes you best is your courage. No surprise, Socrates would say, because democracies are all about the spirit, and the excellence of the spirit is courage. Okay, and this is the defining feature or the special qualification that the soldier has to rule. The soldier experiences a kind of pleasure, and it's not fully intellectual, but it definitely has an intellectual component to it. Why? Because from Socrates' perspective, a soldier has to know what courage is so they can know what it is appropriate to be afraid about, and when it is appropriate, even though you're afraid, to act courageously. Okay, so that's based on a certain kind of knowledge, a moral knowledge, a philosophical knowledge. So these soldiers will have to have at least some elements of philosophy if they aren't just brutally ruling by violence and brutally, scaring people into submission. That's not a democracy, that's a tyranny. Okay, so these soldiers have a kind of pleasure, and some of it is intellectual. But even more than that, it's kind of located in the body. Their pleasure is the happiness of honor. Their pleasure is the recognition of being excellent in regard to their soldiering, their military conduct. They hold themselves to certain moral standards when they get on the battlefield, and they hold themselves to moral standards when it comes to getting out on the battlefield, and they hold themselves to moral standards in negotiating war and peace, negotiating peace treaties and so forth. Okay, and that's the kind of happiness that they're going to have. In the third case, and this is the third best kind of city, we haven't got soldiers. So take Callipolis. Once again, there are 3 levels. We haven't got the first level. There aren't a lot of philosopher types around. You haven't got soldiers. You've got nobody who's really willing to, brave bodily harm to do the honorable thing and defend their city, for example. So you've got basically the everybody else category. In this case, Socrates is still going to ask, who should be put in charge? And Socrates is saying, put the rich in charge. Put the rich in charge. Why? Well, in this case, in this situation, the best you can achieve, Socrates would say, is an oligarchy. Oligarchy just means rule of the rich. The archy is different than the cracy we saw in democracy. It means leading or ruling. Initiating is another translation. And the oligarchy part comes from wealth and riches. Okay, so rule of the rich. Why? Because the rich do have an excellence. They do have a virtue, which is their special qualification. It would be moderation. Now, in Callipolis or democracy, everybody's got moderation, to be clear. But again, we're dealing with here's the best you can do. The rich have a moderation to them. They can't go, buck wild, crazy cocaine parties or whatever every night, because that would interfere with them getting up the next morning, putting on a suit and tie. Pre-pandemic times, I realize that's very weird, and go to the office and try and do business. So they've got to moderate their desires. They've got to be able to control themselves. They've got to be able to discipline themselves. Okay, so the rich have a moderation. And why do they have this moderation? Because they know that there are certain desires that are necessary to their ultimate goal, which is growing their business, earning profits, and making stuff, making a profit. Okay, so this is what Socrates calls necessary desires. And Socrates thinks that the rich will pursue what is necessary in order to make those profits and will be able to ignore what is not necessary to making those profits. Okay, so necessary in terms of the ultimate goal of the rich, which is to become richer. Okay, so the rich too have a kind of pleasure. The rich can take some kind of pride, for example, in the fact that, yes, they have invented some great product, or they have run a very successful business, or they have taken the wealth they inherited and turned it into yet more wealth. Okay, so that's the pleasure they have. Then we've got democracy. Democracy is really the first city type that Socrates thinks embodies no excellence. He's basically trying to say democracy is not excellent. And this lack of excellence in the city as a whole has to do with the lack of excellence of the rulers. And in a democracy, all Greeks would have agreed that who's in charge is the demos. The demos has a lot of ways we can translate it. One is ordinary people. Another is the poor. The poor. So in this way, democracy is the opposite of oligarchy. Democracy can be translated as the people. That's a phrase that we use a lot in the United States. I've chosen here to go with the masses. The masses. So let's be clear. You've got a mass of people. They are, on the whole, Socrates thinks, not excellent. We could also say mediocre. The masses may have some excellent people in it, but they're only excellent as individuals. And they aren't in charge of the entire city. If they were, we'd be in oligarchy, democracy, or Callipolis. Okay. And what's the problem with the masses, according to Socrates? The problem is they are defined by unnecessary desires, whereas the rich were at least able to moderate themselves and say certain kinds of desires are good. Good for what? Good for making a profit. Other desires are less good and they're unnecessary because they don't help me make a profit. There is no such distinction or discernment in the masses, at least not as a whole. Therefore, they lack these elements of wisdom, right? That wisdom is a kind of discernment. Even the rich had to have a kind of wisdom and able to discern what's necessary and unnecessary. The masses lack that. So they pursue all kinds of desires in every which direction without restraint because they haven't got the moderation that comes with knowing what's necessary and what's unnecessary to pursue a particular kind of good. Okay, so that's democracy, and we will talk more about democracy on Monday. Let me just very quickly, with the minute or two we have left, round out this fivefold distinction. Here's the fifth category. It's the worst of all possible cities. It's tyranny. And you'll notice here that Socrates thinks that democracy and tyranny are very close together. And when he introduces tyranny, he talks about how tyrannies emerge out of democracies. He talks about how the tyrant is precisely the one with Thrasymachus-like skills of wooing the masses, of metaphorically taming the beast, becoming a kind of beast master. So in a way, Socrates is blaming tyranny on democracy. And where the masses simply were mediocre and lacking in excellence, the tyrant is anti-excellence. Whatever excellence would have been, he goes to the opposite extreme. So he's lacking excellence in a particular kind of antagonistic and violent and brutal way. Instead of wisdom, outright ignorance. Instead of courage, shameless cowardice. Instead of moderation, indulgence, 24/7. Okay, so you see here how all the excellences of the other city type have been stripped away until you come down to their absolute polar opposite, and that's tyranny. That's tyranny. There's no desire for excellence, and hence there's no pleasure of achieving a certain excellence. Rather, you've got the desire for anti-excellence. You allow those desires free rein. In more common sense terms, you're out there basically stealing from people, you're lying to them, you're killing and maybe assaulting people, maybe you're raping, a sexual assaulter, and so forth. You're a tyrant. You're a tyrant. And you think other people are tools to achieve your weird, perverse, tyrannical pleasures. And yes, it is a kind of pleasure, but Socrates is very clear about this. He says it's an unlawful pleasure. It's perverted. And this pleasure is not really all that satisfying. And we'll see Socrates' arguments for why the tyrant is not actually happy, despite the achievement of this unlawful pleasure.